Hello friends, today we are going to see about deadlock in DBMS. It is defined as a system in deadlock state if there exists a set of transactions such that every transaction in the set is waiting for another transaction in the set. So, when multiple transactions are occurring simultaneously, when one transaction it will be waiting for the resources which has been holded by the other transaction. There occurs a deadlock. Let us see an example for this. Here, there are two processes, namely process 1 and process 2. Similarly, there are two resources R1 and R2. Here, the process P1 is holding the resources R2 and which requires R1. While the process P2 holds the resources R1 and it requires R2. Hence, there is a cyclic process where process P1 is waiting for the process P2 to release the resource. Similarly, the process P2 is waiting for the process P1 to release the resources. Hence, the deadlock occurs. So, the deadlock can be handled using two techniques. One is deadlock prevention and deadlock avoidance. Second, the deadlock detection. Here, the first one is deadlock prevention. Deadlock prevention method is suitable for large database if the resources are allocated in such a way that deadlock never occurs. Then the deadlock can be prevented. The database management system analyzes the operations of the transaction, whether they can create a deadlock situation or not. That means before they are developing the database, they will be analyzing all the kinds of operations which is going to be take place in that particular database, and they'll come to a conclusion that whether their deadlock situation will be arised or not. If it arises, then that DBMS never allowed that kind of transaction to be executed. So this is implemented in a large database. There are two types. One is wait and die. Next one is wound wait. So, wait-die scheme. In this scheme, if a transaction requests for a resource which is already held with a conflicting lock by another transaction, then the DBMS simply checks the timestamp of both the transactions. It allows the older transaction to wait until the resource is available for execution. Here, let us consider two transactions which is in conflict by a lock. Hence, there is a possibility of occurrence of deadlock. At that time, it will check for the timestamp of each transaction. That is, both the transaction timestamp is being checked. And it will allow the older transaction to wait until the resource is made available for its execution. That is the process of wait and die. The second one is wound wait scheme. In wound wait scheme, if the older transaction requests for a resource which is held by the younger transaction, then the older transaction forces the younger one to kill the transaction and release the resources. After a minute delay, then this younger transaction is restarted but with the same timestamp. Let us consider two transactions here. One is older and the other one is younger. When the older one is requesting for the resources which is being holded by the younger transaction, it will make the younger one to stop its execution and release the resource for the older transaction. After delay, it starts its execution. That is, it is restarting its execution but with the same timestamp. If the older transaction has held a resource which is requested by the younger transaction, then the younger transaction is asked to wait until the old one releases. So this is vice versa of the previous one. The next one is deadlock avoidance. When a database is stuck in a deadlock state, then it is better to avoid the database rather than aborting or restarting the database. Because when a process is being executed, that is, when a transaction is executed, there occurs a deadlock. In order to avoid that, the possibility is aborting or restarting. But instead of doing these two processes, it is a waste of time and resources. It is better to avoid that particular deadlock. So, deadlock avoidance mechanism is used to detect any deadlock situation in advance. A method like wait for is used for detecting the deadlock situation, but this method is suitable only for smaller databases. But comparatively, when there is a huge database, the deadlock prevention method is advisable. The next technique is deadlock detection. Here, a wait for graph is developed. This is suitable method for deadlock detection. In this method, a graph is created based on the transaction and their lock. If the created graph has a cycle or closed loop, then there is a deadlock. The wait for graph is maintained by the system for every transaction which is waiting for some data held by the others. The system keeps checking the graph if there is any cycle in the graph. Let us see Example, there are two transactions here, T1 and T2. That is where T1 waits for lock, that is R2, which is waiting for the resource R2. Similarly, T2 is waiting for the resource R1 and waits for the lock. Here it forms a cycle, that is T1 is waiting for T2 to release, and similarly T2 is waiting for the T1 to release. So here occurs a cyclic process, and this is the graph which helps to identify the deadlock detection. Thank you.